There's a question Zelda asked at the like class number two, I think, that I want to hopefully get to via the Gra. And I spoke about it on Shabbat, and it was very hard for people to get their head wrapped around it. So hopefully this group will have an easier time because you're my students, so you're nimble and you're quick. Um, so Zelda asked, how is it that people didn't know that Esther was Jewish? Meaning that presumably she was taken from the house of Mordechai, and um, her assumption was people knew that Mordechai was Jewish. He's a big rabbi, he's a big Jewish leader. So that's not 100% clear from the text, but it makes sense to say that people knew at the very least he was Jewish from the beginning of the story. Now, later on, they definitely know he's Jewish. The Torah says, I mean, the Megillah says that he didn't bow down to Haman. When they pushed him about it, it became known that it was because he was Jewish. So at that time, presumably people could have made the connection, but they didn't. So the question is, why not? If they, assuming they took her from the house of Mordechai, and at least later on, and probably from the beginning, they knew Mordechai was Jewish. How did they not know that Esther was Jewish? So we'll get back to that. So these of you just came in. Um, this sort of a question I want to get back to towards the end of this year. There's a gra that is mind blowing. And I was saying that I presented over Shabbat. People had a hard time, figure understanding it. So B'ezrat Hashem, we'll speak about it. Okay, so we are on Perek Hay at the beginning. Our goal is to get into Perek Vav also, so that by next week, Erev Purim, Erev Tanit Esther, as we found out from last year, we will have covered most of the Megillah. The only thing that we will be needing to complete is Prakim Tet and Yud, right? Chapter 9 and 10. Chapter 9 is very long. Chapter 10 is short, so we'll split them up, do the first part of 9 the following week, and then the second part of 9 and the chapter 10 the week after that. Okay, that's the plan. Let's take a look inside. Pasuk Aleph, V'yehi b'yom hashlishi v'tilbash Esther malchut v'tamod b'chatsa beit hamelech hapnimit nochach beit hamelech v'hamelech yoshev al kisei malchuto beveit hamalchut nochach petach habayit. Okay, so it was on the third day of the fasting, if you remember. And Esther was clothed in malchut, in royalty. We'll see what Rashi has to say about that. And she stood in the house of the inner house of the king, the inner chamber of the king, across from the actual Beit HaMelechim, means the room, right, the throne room, right, and in fact the king was sitting on the throne, right, Kisei Malchuto, right, the chair, literally the chair of his monarchy, but it's a throne in the royal chamber across from the opening of the house. Okay, he sits across from the opening of the house so he can see anybody coming in. It's interesting. Presumably there are guards only outside. There's no discussion about Esther running into anyone else. But presumably, if you were able to get past the guards, or in the case of Esther, you lived inside the palace, very close to the king's chamber, so you wouldn't be stopped by the guard. But the law still existed that you could not enter without the king's permission. Okay, so I said we would talk about the word. There's a lot of Rashis I want to cover this class. I said that we would discuss the word malchut. So Rashi's question here should be obvious to you. What's the problem with the word malchut or the phrase malchut? The Tilbash Esther Malchut. What's the problem with it? So, I mean, I translated quite literally, and I said that she wore royalty. Is there a problem?
What does that mean? Like, what is she wearing?
Well, okay. Can you push that a little further? What do you mean, what's she wearing?
Like, is she wearing a crown or like a royal robe or something? Like, what's, I don't
Okay, so
know.
you started dancing around the question.
Okay.
Yeah, very.
It- Is it that it doesn't say royal clothes, it just says royalty, so it doesn't say clothes.
Yeah, yeah, it's missing. The term is lacking something, and that's what gets Leah to ask the question: what is she in fact wearing? Right? It's not clear. Malchut doesn't really communicate what she's wearing. Now, Big Day Malchut doesn't tell you exactly what she's wearing, but we get the idea. In other words, this doesn't seem to be the normal way of presenting it. So Rashi says that on the Pshat level, it's like one of these words that we assume, right? But we prefer in the Tanakh not to assume words unless it's really obvious. But here it's not so obvious, especially given the backdrop of Vashti, right? Remember, Vashti wore her crown and nothing else, right? Back then, in the first chapter. So Rashi says the pshat, right? This is the pshat which is obvious. Bigdei malchut berotenu amru shelavshta ruach hakodesh. And it gives a proof text, another place where the word lavsha is used for the Holy Spirit. That this is a hint, it's telling us Rashi that the writers of the Megillah are hinting to the idea that she was clothed with the Holy Spirit, with inspiration, because she's really on her own. There's no nevuah here. There's no nevuah telling her what to do. And we'll see, it's not clear that she has a plan, right? So the writers of this book are telling us that she was given divine aid in terms of coming up with a plan. Okay, let's go on. ויקרות, פסוק ב', ויקרות המלך את אסתר המלכה עומדת בחצר נוסעה, הן בעיניו, ויושט המלך לאסתר השרביט הזהב אשר בידו, ותקרא ואסתר ותיגע בראש השרביט. Right, it was when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the courtyard, um, bring up grace or charm in his eyes. In other words, he saw that he had a favorable reaction to her, even though he hadn't seen her for 30 days, which is, I think we mentioned is a strange thing. He stretched out the scepter to Esther, the golden scepter, sorry, that was in his hand. And Esther came close and she touched the head of the scepter, right? So that was the process that you needed to do to formalize your acceptance. Fine. Pasuk Gimel. V'yomer la hamelech malach Esther המלכה ומה בקשתך עד חצי המלכות ויינתן לך. So the queen said the king said to her, what is it, Esther, the queen, and what is your request up until half of the kingdom, and it will be given to you. Okay, so here also there's a Rashi, and I don't think that there's a textual question per se, but there is a question nonetheless. Rashi is going to speak about Ad Chatzia Malchut. What's strange about that? Again, I think it's just a logical problem. Anyone? If you were Achashverosh, would you say this? It's a pretty dangerous statement to make, even if you trust Esther. Right? Chatzia Malchut, is he really willing to give up half of his kingdom for her? It's hard to imagine he means that. So if he doesn't mean it, why does he say it? right? Why does he say it in this way, right? There's a lot of ways to exaggerate. What makes him exaggerate in this fashion? To say, in other words, I'll give you an English language expression. I'll give you the world, right? You don't really mean that. Well, most of us don't have the world to give, right? In the case of Achashverosh, he has a large part of the world to give. But why, if it's just an expression, an exaggeration, we call derech guzma, so why is he being cheap? Give her the whole kingdom. And if it's real, right, how can he possibly say such a thing? Right? So Rashi is there on that thing. I mean, again, he's quoting the rabbis in Masechet Megillah, who say that it's speaking. Look in Rashi, ad chatzia malchut, davashu be'amsa, something that's in the middle of his kingdom, right? And his kingdom, we know, stretched to Africa, right? Mehodavat Kush, from India to Ethiopia. So what's in the middle? Israel is about in the middle, not exactly, but more or less. So says Rashi, B'chatzi Malchut hu Beit HaMikdash, right? And that is where the Beit HaMikdash is. And the Persians, Rashi continues, the Persians had allowed for its rebuilding already. Achashverosh's father had, right? Koresh. And Achashverosh, and then he stopped it. He stopped in the middle. There were complaints, etc. And Achashverosh continued with that with that policy of not allowing the Jews to build the Beit HaMikdash. So Chazal say whether he intended it or not. It's interesting because at this point he doesn't know she's Jewish, right? Does he suspect? Is it so central in his agenda that he needs to watch out just in case she's Jewish? Not clear. But in any case, whether it's conscious or unconscious, however we want to understand it, this is how Chazal understand what he was saying. That I'm willing to give you a whole lot, but there's one thing I'm not going to give you, and that's permission to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. That is something antithetical, right? Now, why it should be antithetical to Achashverosh, and especially towards the end of the story, right, is an interesting question, but not for right now. Okay, so next pasuk, fascinating pasuk. A lot of people speak about it. Pasuk Daled v'tomei Esther im el hamelech tov yavo hamelech v'aman hayom el hamishte asher asiti lo. So Esther said, if it's good for the king and Haman should come today to the feast that I made for him. Made for him, meaning for the king, right? She speaks the third person, right? Presumably that's the way they communicate. Even the queen has to communicate to Ahasuerus in third person to show him honor. Okay, so everybody asks, what's the question everybody asks? Go ahead, ask it.
Why is Haman there?
Yeah, why is she inviting Haman, right? Why is she inviting Haman? Obvious question. And a lot of answers are given to it. So let's say the way Rashi presents it is fascinating. So let me just first tell you, there's about 10 answers to this question in the Gemara, one after the other. And this is how Rashi presents it. Yavam Mel v'Aman, Rabbeinu Amru Tamim Harbe, B'dvar, Marata Esther Shezimna et Haman. So the rabbis, again, the rabbis in the Gemara, and Midrash also, gave many reasons about this thing, what Esther saw, to invite Haman. Then he says, "Kedei lekana'o b'melech u'b'sarim, sha'melech yachshov shu chashuk eleya v'yahagenu." So he gives one of the reasons. And he says, in order to make him jealous, right, to make the king jealous of Haman, both the king as well as the other ministers, such that the king would think that he's desirable to her. Haman is desirable to Esther, and that they're going to kill him. That they're going to kill Esther and Haman have a plot to kill Achashverosh. Okay, so and then Rashi continues and says ve'od tamim rabim, and many other reasons, right? So there's an obvious question here, needs to be answered, but there's no clear answer. So it's fascinating when the Gemara presents these 10 answers, and Rashi obviously feels that this one is most powerful. On the other hand, was it Rabbi Baravua, one of the later rabbis, saw Eliyahu and asked him, what's the right answer to this question? Eliyahu Navi. And Eliyahu Navi said, all the answers that all the rabbis gave. They're all right. Right? So it's a fascinating discussion. It's not something that happens often in the Gemara. I think on some level it's saying that it remains a mystery. It remains a mystery. But what Rashi is telling us is that it has to be answered. She has to have some sort of logic in order to do this, which is one of the other answers, by the way, is to have your enemy close at hand, meaning if she should get her way, that Haman should be punished and hopefully killed, right? So she doesn't want him to escape. So she wants him right there. Okay. So there are many reasons, and it ultimately remains a mystery. What I spoke about on Shabbat was that there's a lot of open questions, that there's a lot of hidden things in this Megillah, right? Which shouldn't surprise us, right? Esther, right? Esther is about Hester Panim. Tov. Okay, let's go on. Pasuk Hey. ויאמר המלך מהרו את המן לעשות דבר אסתר, ויבוא המלך והמן אל המשתה אשר עשתה אסתר. So the king said, hurry Haman to do the word of Esther, and the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared, that Esther had made. By the way, apparently it's also unusual from the historical record to dine the king and the queen and a minister, even as the prime minister, right? That's an unusual thing. Either you're having a business meeting and your wife's not invited, right? A matter of state, or you're having an intimate dinner with your immediate family, right? So this is unusual, and clearly it elicits is meant to elicit some reaction from Achashverosh. We'll see later on the Gra gives a very surprising possibility as well. The Gra has some interesting things to say about the Megillah in general. Okay, so in any case, Haman is given the order, and they come. Achashverosh and Haman come to the party. So pasuk Vav Yom Hamel Esther Mishtayayin Mashalatech Inatin Lach Mankashatech Ad Chatzi Malchut V'Te'az. So we don't have time to go into it now, but some of the Meforshim noticed the different ways Achashverosh expresses himself. The verbs are not always the same, right? The things that he's giving is not the same. So something for you to notice, and if you have time, maybe to look at some of the Mefarshim, like the Malbim, who speaks about the differences. In any case, the translation is that the king said to Esther at the wine party. You'll notice here before it was Mishteh, now it's Mishteh Yain, right? Presumably from the context here is that there's a lot of drinking, right? And that's when he says, what is your question or query, and it'll be given to you. What is your request until half of the kingdom, and it will be done, right? So I said there are different languages, different wording here that is worth looking into. Okay, pasuk zayin. V'tayin Esther v'tomer she'elati u'bakashati. And you'll notice that Esther used a very formal language. They're both using very formal language throughout. We're seeing a lot of formality, a lot of pomp and circumstance, right? Which on some level, as said, I think is a parody of the way things ran in the empire. So Esther answered and said, my question or my query and my request is, אם מצאתי חן בעיני המלך, ואם על המלך טוב, לתת את שאלתי, ולעשות בקשתי, יבוא המלך והמן אל משתה, אשר עשה להם, ומחר יעשה כדבר המלך. So her question is, if I found favor in the eyes of the king, and if it's good for the king to give to answer my question and to do my request, then the king and Haman should come to the party, the feast that I will make for them, and tomorrow I will do the word of the king or the matter of the king. Okay, so there's a big overriding question here. Again, it's just a logical question. What's the logical question?
Why is she kicking the can down the road and not just doing it now?
Yeah, right. In other words, she's going to do the exact same thing again, a second time. What was the point of having the first party? Now, I think a very possible reading is that she lost her nerve, right? In other words, even the wording, right? My question, it sounds like she's stalling for time, right? She's not sure what she wants to do. And she, comes up with some idea just off the top of her head. What can I ask? I don't want to say what I want, and I don't want to be a fool. So my answer is, let's do another party, right? But it's clear that there's a request that the party is not the request. That seems to be fairly clear. That the request, the party is the context for the request, right? So presumably Achashverosh senses that there is some sort of stalling going down. By the way, according to what we saw in Rashi, that it's to build jealousy and to make him think that maybe Esther and Haman are plotting against him. Incidentally, one of the Mefarshim suggests that this approach would lead to both of them being killed, which he was willing to have happen. Because as long as Haman was killed, that was the main thing, right? She already said, I'm willing to die, right? That was her response to Mordechai. So in any case, I think the simplest reading is that of hesitation. I don't know if anybody saw the Even Ezra. I think the Even Ezra can be read in that way. Even Ezra on Chet, he says, ולפי דעתי, a couple words in, שאיכרה אסתר לדבר ביום הראשון במשתה היין. Dina, hello? Excuse me. Yeah. So what does he say? So he says, לפי דעתי שאיכרה אסתר לדבר ביום ראשון בשתי היין בעבור שלא ראתה שום עוד שחידש השם בעבור תענית ישראל. וכאשר ראתה ביום השני דבר גדולת מרדכי חיזק ליבה. Right? So says the Even Ezra that she was looking for a sign, right? I mean, what the Even Ezra is relying upon is that she did go through with the plan of the second party. I know she could have repeated this ad nauseum, right? A third time, a fourth time, right? At some point, the king would lose interest. But what happened between party one and party two? So a lot happened. That's what the Ibn Ezra points out. I think the Alshich says something very similar, that Mordechai was raised up. He had this big ceremony, which in the Megillah, the story of Mordechai being raised, which we'll see next week, is really sort of a side story, right? When he's raised and honored on the horse, it's not intrinsically connected to the narrative at all. So Ibn Ezra says, what's it doing there? And what happened between party one and party two? So in terms of the storyline. So the Ibn Ezra says that this event strengthened Esther to go through with it. That's what made her believe that God was agreeing with her plan and that she should go forward. And that's what she did. Okay? Okay, let's go on. Pasuk Tet, V'yetzeh Haman b'yom hahu sameach v'tov lev v'kirot Haman et Mordechai b'shar HaMelech v'lo kam v'lo za mimenu v'yimaleh Haman al Mordechai hema. So Haman went out on that day, right? He just left the party, and he was very happy. His heart was good. And when Haman saw Mordechai at the gate of the king, and Mordechai did not get up and did not move before him, so Haman was filled with anger. So the Gra points out that, and the Malbim I think as well, that when a person is so happy with themselves and feeling very respected, right? So specifically at that point, if they're disrespected, it's much harder, much harsher, much more difficult, and something that elicits a real strong reaction. And that's what happens here. Pasuk Yud. V'tapak Haman v'yavol beito v'yishlach v'yaveh et oavav et zerah ishto. So Haman held himself back, and he went to his house, and he sent and brought his friends, Ohavav, his friends, and Zeresh, his wife. So this story is interesting. So what's his reaction to the story with Haman? He brings people that he wants to get advice from. And in Pasuk Yud Aleph, Shapell Haman et kvod oshro verov banav v'et kol asher gidlo hamelech v'et asher nis'o al hasarim v'avdei hamelech. Right, so Haman told them about his the glory of his wealth and the greatness of, or the great number of his sons. There's one source that says he had 100 children or 100 sons, right? We read about Aser b'nei Haman, but there's one source that says he has 100. In any case, and all that the king had made him, had brought him up, and that which he had made him rise over the other ministers and the servants of the king. Vayomer Haman, Pasuk Yud Bet, Vayomer Haman, af lo hevi'a Esther malka im hamelech el hamishte asher asta ki imoti, v'gam lachani karu la im hamelech. It's a continuation. If you remember, we said before that a sentence can go over several psukim. Granted, this Vayomer Haman also said, the beginning was the Saper and his Vayomer, but be that as it may, Haman said, right, also Esther, the queen, didn't bring anybody with the king to the feast that she made except for me. And also tomorrow I'm called there with the king. And continuing, וכל זה איננו שווה לי בכל עת אשר אני רואה את מרדכי יהודי יושב בשער המלך. And all of this is not worth anything to me all the time that I see Mordechai, the Jew or the Judean, sitting in the gate of the king. Okay. I think we've spoken about this before, and other people, and obviously it's famous thing that Haman has everything except for one thing, and that one thing ruins everything for him, which is on level one level, pathological and pathetic. On another level, it's not uncommon to be focused on what we're missing. We all do that. But we would think, well, if all I was missing is this one thing, then I wouldn't act like Haman. But that is often not the case. And certainly if you're someone like Haman, right, he's an evil person, self indulgent, right, all sorts of negative things, and this shouldn't surprise us. But as we can see from the next verse, he seems to be turning to them for advice, right? Before I skipped a Rashi, which I think is important to review in Pasuk Chet, Macha Seket V'Hamelech, right? I'm going to do the words of the king, right? So what word of the king, right? If she's just talking about answering, making a request, she likely should have said it otherwise, in another way. So Rashi says that she's going to reveal her identity. I'm saying that now because, as I said, at the end of this year, I want to get back to this thing, and I see Zelda's with us now. We're going to answer the question you asked Zelda the second week, so get ready. In any case, so he's boasting about all this great stuff that's going on to him, and yet he's got this big problem he wants relieved, and the problem is Mordechai. Okay, and after we see the answer, I want to try to understand the problem a little better because it's really not so clear. And as we know, he's bothered by Mordechai, but presumably there's a solution. And presumably the solution is what they're going to tell him. V'tomelo zeh ishto v'kol havav yasu eitz gavoa hamishim hava uvoker amor lamelech v'yitlu et Mordechai alav uvo im hamelech el hamishte samech v'yitav hadavar lifnei Haman v'yas ha'etz. So Zeresh, his wife, and all of his friends told him, right? As you know, the verb refers to the first person, but it's clear that they're all telling him, which could, on a simple reading, it could show how simple the answer is. They're all telling him the same thing. In any case, what do they tell him? Yasu etz gavoa, make or a tree or a pole, a wooden pole, should be made that's 50 amma tall. And you know that an amma is about 1.5 feet, so that's 75 feet. Was that 25 yards? It's pretty tall. It's pretty tall, right? Several story building. And in the morning, say to the king that he should that Mordechai should be hung upon it, and go with the king to the party happily. And the matter was good in front of Haman. So he made the pole, the wooden pole. Okay. So the question here is, what great idea did they give him that made him so happy? What's with the pole that seems to, if they're just telling him to kill Mordechai, Haman didn't think of that idea of asking. He's very influential. He's the prime minister. Mordechai is pretty much a petty servant. To make it public, that was the idea. Okay, Zelda says to make it public. So he wanted to do it privately, and they're telling him to make it public. How does that help? So, any other ideas or thoughts? Not necessarily that. What do they do? Like what's with the fear? Fear of What? Okay, so Zelda, you're saying along the lines of the Malbim. I don't know if you heard the Malbim before. So, and I don't know if anybody looked at the Malbim, but the Malbim says that the way I'm not going to read it inside; it's too long. But the Malbim says that basically Haman understood his problem with Mordechai as a personal vendetta, right? So, granted, he's going to kill all the Jews as a result of this personal vendetta, but that's not what he told Achashverosh. He didn't tell Achashverosh, "I want to kill the Jews because I hate Mordechai." If you remember, he said, "No, these really bad people. They're scattered," right? Doesn't even reveal the name. Out of possible fear that's not going to go well, but whatever. It's not clear from the text that Achashverosh has any idea about the vendetta between Haman and Mordechai. And says the Malbim, were he to reveal it and say, there's this guy that's really bothering me in the court. He's disrespecting the prime minister by not getting up, and therefore he should kill him, right? Any king has to have, no matter how bad a king, has to have some sense of justice, or he'll be deposed. Meaning you can pervert justice, but there has to be a system of justice. And for Haman to do this, it's possible that he could get it, after all, he's the prime minister, it's possible he could get it through. But the fear, says the Malbim, is it will make him look really bad. Because here's the prime minister having this vendetta, which looks extremely petty. Right? He's a small court official, and Haman is so upset with him that he wants him, executed. What's the crime? Well, he didn't bow down to me. Well, it's true. It was a royal edict, but that's something that the court and the officers are going to need to enforce if it needs to be enforced. And if the penalty is indeed death, which it almost certainly wasn't, right? That's not Haman's business. So says the Malbim that very similar to what Zelda said, that they're telling him, no, make it into a state affair. Make it a state affair that Mordechai is a threat to the state, right? And how do you do that? By publicizing his death. In other words, go to the king and say, there's someone who's threatening the kingdom, and I've already prepared the punishment for him, right? And that takes it out of being a personal vendetta. All of a sudden, it's a state affair, right? So Haman can get his way, right? Before, the only way he figured out how to get rid of Mordechai was to kill the whole Jewish people, right? Not extremely practical, but there was a strategy for it. He didn't have a strategy to kill Mordechai as an individual, which, as I'm thinking, is fascinating, right? We say that God orchestrates the whole story. We usually think of that as the good part of the story, but God is also orchestrating the bad part of the story, right? According to this way of reading it, right? We know the Gemara in Megillah says that the threat posed by Haman brought a greater tshuva, greater repentance than had happened in all of Jewish history up until then. Right? They said all the Nevi'im tried hard, and sometimes there was, sometimes there wasn't, but nothing causes great a tshuva as the threat they faced from Haman. Presumably, that was a major part of God's plan, not just to save the Jews, but rather to scare the Jews in order to get them to the right thing. That was really the point. So if you look at it, it's fascinating that Haman is really, again, if one wants to bracket the idea that he's from Amalek, and incidentally, I didn't look it inside, but I trust the person who wrote it. Someone said that in the Yerushalmi, it says that the fact that he's called an Agagi does not mean that he comes from Agag, meaning he's not physiologically from Amalek, right? So that's pretty fascinating, according to the Yerushalmi. Right? If I have time, I'll look it up. But be that as it may, uh, we could understand the story as the decree against all the Jews was really Haman's only way of getting back at Mordecai. He didn't care about the Jews, just like Achashverosh doesn't care, right? That this is, a running theme, the sort of apathy that goes throughout this very dangerous and evil apathy. So uh, what Haman realizes in this part of the story is he wants Mordecai dead now. He can't live another 12 months, right? And this is also God's hand, that the lottery is 12 months later, right? Which is frustrating. It's frustrating for Haman, right? He's got to wait. I mean, he said, okay, let's just give it a chance. And he loses. I don't know if you ever play dice and you're hoping for 12. I mean, it's literally, instead of 12, what does he get? Well, I guess you get a 2, right? That's the lowest you can get with 2 dice. So he instead of 12, he gets a 2. So he's fit to be tied. And finally, according to the Malbim, they have a plan. Now, you don't have to go with the Malbim. It's a little difficult, right? It's a little roundabout. But I think the question is a very strong question, right? Again, one of the points of darkness in the story, one of the parts of Hester Panim, that we're not exactly clear about what was the problem, what was the answer. So Mefarshim, as is their job, try to give us some answers. But I think the text itself is fairly unclear on this point. Okay, before we go to the next parak, any questions, comments? Okay. So, okay, so there's famous pasuk, right? There's a number of famous psukim. This is obviously one of them. Perek Vav, pasuk Aleph, Belaylahu, Nadash Nata Melech, V'yom Avi et Sefer Hazichronot Divrei Yamim, V'yu Nikraim Lifnei HaMelech. Okay, so as the Ibn Ezra says, Rashi only alludes to it. It's very interesting, but we all understand when it talks about Shenat HaMelech, so it may be a play on words. The Melech here may be also referring to God. Right in the story, there's no question that on the Peshat level, which is probably why Rashi does not mention it, right? On the Peshat level, it's very clear that we're talking about Achashverosh, right? Because the fact that the king didn't, let me translate it. So on that night, the sleep of the king was wandering, meaning it wasn't coming to him. And he said to bring the book of events of the of the Chronicles, right? So one of the Mefarshim suggests this was a shorter book. I think it's the Gras. It's a shorter book. It's not the whole history of Persia. It's like basically the newspaper for the last few weeks, and and they should be read rather in front of the king. So clearly, right, the reading of the book, which is going to be in front of Achashverosh, as the story continues, is a result of the king not sleeping, and that king's on the shot level is Achashverosh. So the question is, why didn't he sleep? What happened that made him not sleep? So Rashi gives 2 answers. The Gra and the Ibn Ezra give other answers. We'll look at all 4 very quickly. So if you look at Rashi, so one answer is simply a miracle. God intervened, period, right? It doesn't bring the word God in, as it does not throughout the Megillah. That's, again, part of the Hester Panim in this book. But nevertheless, the fact that he, specifically between the 2 parties, would not sleep and would turn to the story of Mordecai, presumably wasn't the only story there. So that's just a nice, right? Right? Timing is as much of nice as anything else, right? People think, well, maybe the Yam Suf split for natural reasons. There was a wind, and there are some places in the world, apparently in Korea, where this happens. There's water that splits regular time during the year. So maybe naturalistically, one could explain that. Except that in Egypt, it's certainly not a recurring event. And for it to happen exactly when the Jews are standing there and to close exactly when the Egyptians are about to cross in or start crossing in, that's a nace. So Rashi says also, in of itself, for the king not to sleep, for a person not to sleep, and to have a book with Mordechai mentioned and to open to the right part of the book is not a nes nigle. But when you put all this together, this is as strong a miracle as anything else, and more than anything else that happens in the story. In any case, Rashi continues, Yesh omrim, samet libo al shezimna Esther et Haman, shema nidna einayim bo v'yahagehu. So similar to what he said before, but now it's really troubling him. With the first party, Rashi said, well, it's one possibility that this was what Esther was trying to do. But it could be Achashverosh may or may not be a very bright fellow. It's not clear. So he didn't pick up on it. But now he picks up on it that maybe there's something going on with Esther and Haman. They're gonna possibly kill me. Even Ezra, if you look at the last, he gives several possibilities. He said that the first thing he says is Bidrash Nat Malkosh Olam, right? The drash is talking about the sleep of the king of the world, right? But in any case, you go to the end, he says V'yesh omrim, the last V'yesh omrim, he says Yesh omrim ba'avush shnadav shnato shema anushu al davar shnadav v'lo hikimo v'zekarov elai. Maybe he was feeling guilty about having made an an oath and not having fulfilled it. Right? It's interesting. In other words, he was feeling guilty about something. This was on his conscience, the not rewarding Mordechai. And again, a king is someone who is responsible for keeping order and some sort of sense of justice in the kingdom, so people will do the right thing and not disturb him, even if it's self-centered, right? He wants order. So he is concerned that maybe he did something that was out of order. Now, if you look back in Rashi again, right, along the same lines as this, the second Rashi, one line down, ורבתינו אמרו מתוך שנתן ליבו על המן ואסתר, אמר אי אפשר שלא ידע אדם עצתם, שהוא אוהבי ויגלה לי, וחזר ואמר, שמא עשה לי אדם טובה ולא גמלתיו, ואין חושין עוד לי. Right, so this is an elaboration of what Even Ezra says. This is what's found in the Gemara, that he said, if they are plotting against me, how come I didn't hear about it? Before I heard about it with Bigtan and Teresh, right? Why didn't I hear anything about this plot? He said, could be I didn't reward someone who informed in the past, which leads him to, in fact, open up the book and find out about Mordechai. It's interesting, by the way, that he forgot, right? That's also indicative of a certain type of personality, all right? The same personality that was willing to have a drink with Haman after he just decreed to kill an entire people without knowing which people it was, right? So there's a sort of lack of concern, but when he realizes it could have an impact on him, according to Rashi, then he gets more serious about it. Okay, so I said that there's a big raw here that I wanted to focus on. So here we go. And this deals with the issue that Zelda asked about how they didn't know that Esther was Jewish if she came from the house of Mordechai. So says the Gra that Achashverosh felt that the request that she was going to make couldn't be for herself, right? Don't forget, he's not thinking nations. He's thinking people, right? Esther is ultimately, she's not in charge of people. She's a private individual. She's a queen, but she's a private individual. So says the Gra, what from Ahasuerus's perspective, what could she possibly be missing? Right? She's the queen. She can ask, right? Al Chatzia Malchut. She literally can ask for, again, not politically, but in terms of wealth, in terms of anything that she wants to happen for her personal enjoyment or comfort, she's going to get it. So what possibly could she want? It must be for someone else. And there's only one person in her life besides the king, right? Putting what Rashi said on the side. I mean, granted, we sing about Haman, though if it is Haman, Haman has everything he wants also. So the other person that at this point is known, right, that she has a relationship with, and presumably was known from the very beginning, is Mordechai, right? So the Gra says something fantastic. He says, I mean, two things are fantastic. The first thing he says is fantastic is that the understanding of Achashverosh at this point is there's someone who is asking for the favor. There's someone who is going to be asked for, right? That's where Esther and Mordechai fit in. Where does Haman fit in? He's been called there to help Esther. To help Esther request a favor from Mordechai, right? In other words, that's how detached Achashverosh is from what's going on with Haman, right? Remember, he doesn't know which people Haman is said to kill, right? Even though the Jews know, but Achashverosh still doesn't know. The decrees have been sent about this people, and whatever Haman says, that's good enough for him. So the Gra says, in his eyes, it's possible that they're all in cahoots, whatever the word is. But this is the next part is what I want to focus on. Second. Yeah, so so he says that the words of the Gra is that she has to be worried about Abraham, not Abraham, sorry, about Mordechai. And why? Because she has no family as far as he's concerned, right? Ahasuerus doesn't know about any other family, but except for Mordechai shegadla bebeito. So says the Gra, Ahasuerus knows that she was brought up by Mordechai, and yet he doesn't know that she's Jewish. Not because he's stupid, but presumably what that means is, don't forget that the reader knows that they're cousins, but that's just the reader. The story is not known, right? When people outside the house don't know. They do know, says, at least according to the Gra, not everybody will say this, but according to the Gra, they do know that Mordechai raised her, right? So it comes out that Mordechai, as far as Achashverosh is concerned, could have raised a child from any number of peoples, right? Similar, if you know the story of the bamboo cradle, right, where a Chinese child was left at the doorstep of a Jewish couple, and they raised her, right? Now this is slightly different. There were actually non-religious Jews at that time. They became religious partly as a result of this event in their lives, but gradually. But what comes out is a fascinating thing that wouldn't they expect he would raise her as a Jew? Yeah, so it's a good question. So Zelda asked, wouldn't they expect him to raise her as a Jew. So that's not the point, right? When he asks what people, he's not interested in conversion, especially at that time. Conversion is a chidush. It's not something that's obvious, right? He wants to know where is she from, meaning what's her roots, what naturally, genealogically, and it's not clear that that she's from a Jewish background. That's how he doesn't know. In the meantime, it's all sorts of confusion in the house of Achashverosh. Okay, we have 2 minutes. I want to just zoom through wouldn't still be most likely. Yeah, it's interesting. It wouldn't be most likely that she would be Jewish. So according to the Gra, it sounds like it's not obvious at all. Even though it seems to be a stretch. I agree with you. I agree with you. Okay, Pasuk Bet. וימצא כתוב אשר הגיד מרדכי אל בגתנה ותרש שני סייסי המלך משומרי הסף אשר ביקשו לשלוח יד במלך אחשוורוש. And it was found written, as when they opened the book, they found written that which Mordechai said about Bigtan and Teresh, the two guardians of the king from the guardians of the gate, of the doorway, that they sought to send their hands, to attack the king Achashverosh. ויאמר המלך מה נעשה יקר גדולה למרדכי על זה, ויאמרו נערי המלך משרתיו לא נעשה עמו דבר. So the king said what was done, what honor and greatness and pomp was done to Mordechai for this. And the youths of the king, his servants, said, the ones that were responsible for this type of situations, said that nothing, not a thing was done with him. בית המלך חיצונה לאמור למלך לתלות את מרדכי על העץ אשר הכין לו. And the king said, who is in the courtyard? And Haman came into the courtyard. Again, the timing is precious, right? He came into the courtyard of the house of the king, the outer courtyard of the house of the king, to say to the king to hang Mordechai on the pole that he had prepared for him. So this is, a tremendous switch in the events, and from here, things unravel for Haman from this point. So this is really there are two turning points in the story. One is what we talked about last week, when Esther makes the decision to take action to her own hands, and the other change is more subtle on some level here, right? As I said, the story that we're going to read now in this parak is a sort of bracketed story, which doesn't really, on the face of it, advance the story. But I think, as the Eben Ezra and the Alshik pointed out, that it's critical to the story in terms of events, in terms of God's hands. And it was up until now, right? God's hand has been very hidden in terms of protecting the Jews, right? Again, if we think of God's hand as only doing that, then we'll miss the first half of the book. But obviously, the first half of the book is also God's hand, and critically important to remember that we have a tendency to only want to interpret God's hand when it's in our favor, and God is on all the time, whether things are good or bad. Okay, questions, comments, issues, jokes? No. Okay, it's Adar, so you gotta have a good joke. Okay, next week is Erev Tanit Esther, so I expect a good joke from everybody, and we'll see you then. Shavua Tov, Shavua Tov, take care.
Shavua tov, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, Rabbi.
Pleasure.